why we use open source from a business owner's perspective. So my name's Alick. I run Mighall. I've been working in digital since 1994. I run a team of 11. We will be a team of 12 from Monday, which means I can lose the dog, and then still end up with a symmetrical slide. And we've done a range of web development projects over the last 10 years, the majority of which have all been in Drupal. And last year we very proud to have won an Aqua Engage Award for the best community site of 2016. That level of pride was only usurped by having Jurgen Klopp come down to our office to present it to us. While we're talking about football, when I talk to my kids about coming down to Bristol, it just means one thing to them. And I thought, oh, I'll never be able to talk about this. But then I chanced across David's profile on the Microserve website, and so I just couldn't resist to download this on my phone. The quality's a bit poor. But this is Steve Sidwell's wonder strike against Bristol City last season, which was the championship goal of the season. So, yeah, there we go. I'm a Brighton fan, by the way, just in case you hadn't worked that out. So, yeah, we deliver self-sufficiency to our clients. That's what we've always aimed to do, and see ourselves as experts at building content management solutions which deliver operational freedom. So actually that thing that Jan was talking about earlier with the why, what and how, I read that Simon Sinek book, went through that exercise, and this is the why that we came up with. Now, in terms of the history of this presentation, this is about the 6th time that I've given this presentation. I first wrote it in 2012, reflecting back to a period in 2009 where we decided to go open source. And I last presented it in 2015 on Jam's podcast. And actually at that time, Jam was really helpful in terms of giving me some tips on how to kind of make my slides look better. So when I proposed the talk for this camp, I thought, it's great, I won't have to do anything on it at all. I can just kind of present it as it is. And then when I reviewed it last Saturday, well, actually quite a bit has changed in the last couple of years. And then I had to kind of do a panicked kind of rewrite of quite a lot of it. So, you know, what has changed in that period? Well, obviously in the last 2 years, Drupal 8 has come out, Mighall has changed, and I think that the market has changed. And the reason why I think it primarily needed that rewrite is because the considerations of why you might go open source or why you still might maintain the choice to use open source, I think, you know, will change over time. And there are 3 points where in our history, 2007, 2009 and actually now, where we've actually re-asked ourselves that question as why open source. And when I look at the things that we use to decide whether we would stay open source, I think that there are mainly three considerations that we take into account, right? So with any technology project that you look at, I think you've got 3 options open to you, right? You can build it, you can buy it, or you can partner with it, right? So I'm going to use that analogy throughout the rest of this presentation. And by partner with it, that's my kind of equivalent of using open source, because you're working as part of a community, and you know, and they've got like the sort of freedom of open source there. So those are my kind of options: build it, buy it, and partner with it. Now, I used to use that quite a lot when I worked at Yahoo. So here's an example of how I might have used it at Yahoo. So in 2001. When we looked at going into the dating space, we had to kind of make that build it, buy it, or partner with it decision at that point. So the buy it opportunity might have been that we'd have just gone and acquired Match.com, because Match.com hadn't been around very long then. They would have been a more suitable acquisition target than what they might have been 4 or 5 years later when they were much bigger, and Yahoo had to end up partnering with them because it didn't do a very good job of actually building it in the first place. And actually the reason it didn't do a very good job of building it in the first place, well, actually the product was quite good, but like a lot of things that Yahoo did, wasn't prepared to put much money into marketing it. And where that's fatal with a dating website is that if your dating website is successful and one person meets another and they live happily ever after, they have no reason to use the site anymore. So you've got this kind of continuing ongoing marketing spend, and Yahoo just wasn't prepared to put the money behind continually marketing it. Now, when I won my first web development project for Mighall, I had to go through the same process of like, you know, do I build it, buy it, or partner with it? And I was very definitely not going to build a CMS. And I took that decision based on this thinking, a lot of which I feel is still valid today. So I thought the world doesn't really need another CMS, it just needs the ones that are there to get better. Now, at the time, back in 2007, I thought that would probably happen as a result of, you know, just market share and stuff like that. I didn't actually realise then or think about the extent to which community involvement in open source projects would be the things that actually drove the success of CMSs. I always thought that established CMSs were more likely to be able to embrace new trends as they happened and therefore work more seamlessly with existing technology. I thought if you use an existing CMS, it should be easier to find you know, people that can work with that technology, which I think is still true today. I think if you were to build a CMS from scratch, then you run the risk of reinventing a lot of wheels, and that seems pretty pointless, and that would be true today as well. And I think that also a new CMS is more likely to have a greater exposure to bugs or kind of cover limited use cases. And if we have a little back to what the market was like in 2007, so I think back in 2007 there was more demand then for brochureware style sites with simple functionality. I think buy it was often still too expensive. So if you look at some of the kind of off-the-shelf solutions that you could buy or the license fees you were paying, they were still quite pricey. And software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service was still very much in its infancy in 2007. Wix didn't move from Flash to HTML5 until 2002, and obviously, you know, given that the iPhone came out in 2007, and that's when we started to see the rise of, you know, the mobile web, like Wix wasn't really going to kind of become a decent solution for building sites until it could use HTML5. Squarespace didn't really kind of take off until the Brace acquisition in 2014. Acquia was only founded in 2007, so obviously PaaS was very much at its infancy at that point, and that was largely because obviously Amazon, on which Acquia is largely built, only kind of came out with its initial products in 2006. So it was pretty early days for those markets there. Also in 2007, I don't think that open source, it wasn't quite there as far as I was concerned. So WordPress 2.1, that still kind of predates even custom post type. So WordPress was still very much a blogging engine. Joomla 1 had some nice features and a decent manual, but functionally it was still quite limiting. And with Drupal 5 and its legendary learning curve, I'm not really a developer, I'm a product manager by trade, and I just didn't have the time to make the calculations to jump to hyperspace. And yeah, just to remind ourselves of what WordPress 2.1 looked like. You know, people now talk about WordPress being great because of its, you know, its user experience, but actually, if you were comparing WordPress alongside Drupal 5 in 2007, there's not really much difference between the two of them out of the box. And if you were just going to make a choice based on looks, which, you know, I'm definitely not a style over substance person, but I know a lot of people will be, you know, titillated by how something looks rather than how it works, but you would probably have chosen Joomla just because it actually looked a good deal better than either of the other two options that you could take. Looking better than all three of them was the CMS that I ended up building. You know, and that was great because I'd forgotten a lot about the web. You know, before starting at Mighall, I was at Yahoo for 7 years, and working at a global internet company, actually you really lose track of what the internet's really about. I spent most of my last 3 or 4 years there just arguing about budgets and headcount. So writing my own CMS was great. It reminded me of how to code. I learned a lot about my limitations. It made me think about must-haves and nice-to-haves and roadmaps. But the thing is, I loved it too much. I spent too much time working on coding and not enough time thinking about kind of running my business. And in a kind of concept that I stole from my very first DrupalCon in 2011, you know, building your own CMS is a little bit like building sandcastles. It's an awful lot of fun. You can keep continually adding to them, but you're powerless against the tides of change. And 2009, after a couple of years of doing that, I just said, you know, this lunacy has to stop. You know, we need to kind of go back to the drawing board. and start thinking about what we're going to do next. And at that point, we decided to, to embrace open source, largely for these reasons, which I've just cut and pasted from one of our proposal documents. So saying that our preference is to deliver solutions that are based on open source in PHP and MySQL, and that to us freedom is as much about freedom as it is about costs, and about clients being free from tie-ins and to be protected from a business continuity perspective, and about how popular open source solutions are contributed to by thousands of developers. And then plus all these other benefits here at the bottom, which later on I'm going to talk about how I actually think those now apply to where we are with Buy It in 2017. And going back to the self-sufficiency point, given that Mighall had always been about wanting to offer self-sufficiency to its clients, we really felt that, we didn't want our clients to be dependent on us or tied in with us, that they should always have options to be able to kind of take what they brought with us and take it elsewhere if they needed to. But actually, from an agency perspective, I didn't want to have my clients be dependent on me either, because what happens if my business changes, or what happens if because if my business grows and my cost base grows, those clients that I took on when I maybe only had 2 or 3 people, and that was therefore able to charge them a much, much lower rate than what I could charge them when I've got 15 people, might mean that that client needs to kind of move on and go elsewhere as well. Or I might want to need to think about how I manage them out. So, open source really gives you that advantage of not having a dependency either way. So at the point that we decided that we would only use open source solutions, we actually made our own CMS open source. And so we put that out under a GPL license, thinking that our work was largely done on it, but somebody else might want to take it further. Our clients were no longer dependent on us for that solution, so they could take the code and do what they wanted with it. And pretty soon after we put it out as an open source project, something amazing happened, and it was the final part on the road to our conversion to open source. And that was that our CMS that was used by one of our clients, they submitted it to a security review, and they found a vulnerability in it whereby if you tried to log in with a username and password that didn't exist, the message that you get back in the URL would tell you whether that username was a valid username or not. So once you'd got yourself a valid username, you could then potentially brute force the password if the password wasn't set to be that strong. So when that got reported to us, then we had to kind of deal with it in the right way. I often think when things go wrong in your business, it's the way that you deal with them that actually kind of gives you the chance to kind of cement your reputation as either being effective or ineffective. So in some respects, it was good to have a crisis to respond to. But it very much kind of validated our decision to make the thing open source in the first place, because as much as my development team are a great team, they're fairly kind of limited in number. And I would say that it is hard or almost impossible for a small development team to actually code a fully secure solution. And it was only opening up that code to extra pairs of eyes that allowed us to actually find out that there was a vulnerability in the code in the first place. And of course, that validated our approach for going open source in the first place. But of course, the even better news was that it meant that nobody actually got hacked. So how did we end up being in a position where, having chosen to use open source, that we would choose to use Drupal? Well, to be honest, we didn't get there straight away. Which was a bit of a shame, because I'd always got this sense that Drupal was probably a bit of a Lego kit, and it was really a Lego kit that I was looking for. And but my problem with Drupal was that I just couldn't make this jump between what I got from an install page to the kind of sites that people were building. So this is a very early Drupal 6 site, and I just couldn't get my head around how you move from that to that. So what tended to happen is that when we were thinking, actually, I want this kind of Lego kit so I can build an aeroplane and a camper van, but actually what I was having to do, if I was like won a project that was, say, a e-commerce project, then we were going out and looking for some open source e-commerce script. Or if we won a classifieds project, we were doing the same and looking for a classified script. And this happened with a project that we won for Fitness First. So Fitness First came to us. They wanted a social front end to their recruitment platform. So what Fitness First are interested in doing was that they said, we get lots and lots of applicants for all of our jobs, and we just really want to be talking to the person that we're going to give a job to. In recruitment, you want lots of people to apply, but you only really want to have the fewest amount of conversations and hire the right person as quickly as possible. So there are certain things that I guess are kind of, cultural kind of aspects of the fitness industry that, they will want to make sure that people understand before they apply for that job. So, for example, if you're a receptionist at a busy gym, you're working long hours. One of the examples was that a receptionist might come onto this site and write a story about, what they liked about their job, but also what they didn't like about that job. And one of those things they might not like about their job might be clearing sick out of the toilets when someone's kind of done too many of those gels and exercised too hard and then kind of thrown up everywhere, and it's the receptionist's job to kind of clear it up. And if you've got those stories on a site like this and somebody reads them and then they still apply for the job, then you've probably kind of narrowed down the amount of people that you want to talk to. So there was a definite kind of business case for building this, and when we looked at it, we thought, yeah, it's user-generated content. It's a blogging site, and the obvious thing to build it in at that point was to build it in WordPress, and because it had a very limited amount of static content. But actually, that choice to build it in WordPress was very quickly became the kind of wrong decision, because obviously what happened was that the user requirements and the business requirements changed quite quickly over time, and actually the amount of static content that they wanted increased and the amount of other functionality they wanted it increased. And what we ended up having to do was write a lot of custom functionality to deliver in WordPress, something that WordPress couldn't really do out of the box or with its plugins. And in a sense, what that meant we were doing was we were taking something which was a car and being able to change it into an aeroplane, but actually at the end of the day it was still a car. Whereas with Drupal, you've just got bricks and you can build cars and aeroplanes. Now our view of WordPress has now slightly changed on this, and I'm going to come back to why it's changed later, but that's definitely how we saw it back in 2011. Now, when we started working on Drupal, that was because an opportunity just presented itself to us to do some work for ITV. So one of the things that Mighall had done kind of prior to 2011 is that we used to do a lot of editorial content management for large media organisations. So we would put editorial staff and content management staff into Yahoo's offices, AOL's offices, BSkyB's offices, and ITV came to us and said, we would like you to do the same for us, but instead of doing it with content editors, we would like you to do it with Drupal developers. And I thought, yeah, that'll be easy, because Drupal developers just need to know PHP and MySQL, and I can find PHP developers quite easily. So yeah, I'll take that gig on. It'll be really easy. But it wasn't, because I couldn't find any Drupal developers anywhere, and even the Drupal developers I could find were quite happily kind of engaged, working on their own projects or working on their own terms. So it became very, very difficult for us to actually fulfil that commitment to ITV, to the extent that, given I was on the hook to do it, I had to start fulfilling that commitment myself. So we started to learn Drupal at Mighall, and that's how we got into it. And actually, as we started to learn it and then saw the benefits of it, and then saw actually the fact that there's no real development talent out there, kind of made it think that it was a bit of a niche and we could start working on it that way. So that's what we did. And in terms of being able to make that jump between that and that, where we were aided in that was that apart from building this site, so this is the ITV food site which we built from the ground up, but as part of the deal we had to look after a whole portfolio of ITV's existing Drupal 6 sites. So for things like Loose Women and Lorraine and This Morning, they all had their own Drupal 6 sites, but because we were given those finished products in their entirety, we were obviously able to kind of go through the kind of code and everything and work out how they'd been able to jump from here to here, which was something that I hadn't been able to do earlier. Now, I would say that in 2017, obviously the alternatives to Drupal from an open source perspective, and also the SaaS alternatives, have got a lot stronger than they were 10 years ago, but then obviously Drupal has got stronger too. And for me, one of the two of the key areas where Drupal has really improved is actually, now that it's based on more standard OOP technologies, as everyone here will know, it probably makes it easier to find people because you can retrain or reskill people who've got object-orientated skills or who use more standard technologies like Twig or Symfony, or even kind of take .NET developers who are just used to working in an OOP framework and actually kind of making that jump over to working in Drupal 8 isn't particularly as a difficult thing as it was to do when you want to then try and move an OOP programmer into working with procedural PHP in Drupal 7. So that to me is one massive benefit in terms of resolving that talent shortage. And I would say that Drupal 8 is now much more of a CMS out of the box. And you guys, you said earlier, you're a bit daunted about the idea of potentially moving to Drupal 8, but when you do, you're going to find a lot more things in it much more straightforward because it's a much better CMS to start with than what Drupal 7 was. And if you use distributions like Lightning, then that extends that even further. And the other thing that I really like about working with something like Drupal as a product manager is that Drupal is a product. And I think that when you're working with products, you're then thinking about, kind of features and benefits. And I think as something like Mighall, which is a services business, I'm always thinking about how I can kind of productize my service business. So for me, working with Drupal is great. So I can look at Drupal as being a bit like an egg, and you can do lots of things with eggs. They're pretty versatile, fry them, scramble them, poach them, or whatever. And providing you always kind of bear that in mind and remember that it's not a sausage. You've got quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what you can do. And that also, if you're selling a product, that's also, I think, great for a services business because you've maybe got kind of qualified leads that might come to you in terms of saying, we want a Drupal solution. I think the market also kind of helps set the price to some extent as well. When we were selling websites that were built in our own CMS, one of the things that we struggled with the most was that we would always get undercut by somebody, and often trying to kind of win business where the determining factor was price was impossible, because what you could never maybe get that buyer to understand was what trade-off they were making in terms of the quality they were likely to get, particularly if they were over-promised. They were promised the earth on a low price. That made it really difficult. But if you're selling something like Drupal, then it's much more transparent in terms of what the kind of price is set at. Go and look on G-Cloud and look at all of us that are listed on G-Cloud, and actually as part of that framework we kind of have to list our prices. We know pretty much where we're all placed competitively, but I think that's quite a good thing in terms of actually dealing with potential buyers, because they come back and say, yeah, we don't want to pay X for it, we want to pay half of X. It's like, well, when you've got someone that's prepared to pay half of X, go for it, and come back and speak to us if you don't get that. And I think that selling a product actually kind of helps with pricing much more effectively. It's much easier to quote and propose against briefs. I think the gap analysis when you're working with a product, the gap analysis between what's required and what's achievable is a much easier thing to process. And it's much easier to kind of make that trade-off between nice-to-haves and must-haves. I'm sure a number of you here that work in agencies or work responding to briefs have probably seen things in briefs where it will ask you if you're going to need to kind of write a lot of custom functionality to deliver certain use cases, and to maybe even flag that up as part of the process so that the business can decide whether it wants to kind of inherit that level of technical debt. And that's a conversation that you can't necessarily have if you're building it from scratch in the first instance. I also like it that in terms of responding to requests for business, there are just a whole load of repeat learnings that I can use as a product manager, which cuts the time that I need to take out of my development team to ask them to help me contribute to pitches or proposals. So, it's a much more effective thing for me to work at in terms of closing business. And then the other reason that I think it's great is because it builds in business continuity protection as far as my resources are concerned. I'm always terrified that my development team will end up getting run over by the same bus. And you know, and were that to happen and I had to kind of rehire them all, then at least I know I can put out job adverts where I'm looking for specific, relevant and related experience. That's much harder to do in a build it environment where you're asking somebody who just knows PHP to come in and maybe review, you know, a whole bunch of code that's been written in a bad way or not particularly well documented. You know, so there are definite benefits there. And it also helped us, I think, you know, answer our question about when we were embracing open source and embracing Drupal. That was round about the time that I was going through the business exercise of trying to determine what Mighall's why was. And if we're all about delivering operational freedom, then to me that goes hand in hand with using open source, because you need open source to actually make your clients self-sufficient and give them some level of operational freedom. So that unifying that vision, you know, really helped give us a goal around which the whole business could unify, and that definitely helped us out. It also resolved to some extent the problem that I felt I'd had in the early days of my business, which was about how we won work. So very often, you know, we would get a big project in, and to me that was a bit like going out and hunting for a mammoth and dragging it back to the office, and it would keep us going for months and months and months. And then when we got down to the last leg, I would go out and drag another mammoth in and go through that whole process again. And that was great until the mammoth started to run out, and we had to think about other ways of actually, you know, feeding ourselves. And at that level, you think, well, we want something more sustainable. You know, we want to kind of like move more to farming than to hunting. But if you move to farming, you need to start investing in things like tractors and trailers and combine harvesters and barns to kind of like store your grain in. And for me, those are the equivalent of what you use to advertise your services, you know, the tools that you might use to kind of drive social engagement around your products and services, any kind of outbound sales strategy that you have, how you kind of track leads with your clients through a CRM, and obviously anything that you can do in terms of generating word of mouth, which is the best way, obviously, to bring in new business. But if you look at those benefits, actually, and this is one of the things I started thinking about last week as well, you know, can't I do that with, you know, don't I get all those benefits if I just use software as a service? And actually, if I was an agency that was just based around delivering solutions in Squarespace and Wix, then yeah, probably all those things I've just described in the last 2 or 3 slides, I probably get those out of Squarespace and Wix as well. But my clients don't, because they're locked into a vendor at that stage, and that isn't any good. And one of the things that I'm starting to kind of think about to a certain extent is, what does this mean in terms of the platform as a service providers? Because to what extent a platform as a service providers dragging open source solutions into something that becomes closer to a SaaS model and less like a open source model. I think one of the key things as well, that if you're going open source, you have to take a responsibility to contribute back to that community. And as we've spoken a lot about today, and as Jan mentioned earlier in his presentation, you know, the power of community is really key. And then looking at the market in 2007, well, actually, I now think that Build It is becoming a more workable option because of frameworks, you know, and because of open source frameworks like, you know, Symfony, Laravel. You know, being able to kind of like do rapid prototyping in things like Node.js. So to a certain extent, you know, Build It is, whether it's the best option, I don't know, but it's a better option than what it was 10 years ago, definitely, because if you build according to the coding standards of a framework, then you should be able to still deliver a bunch of business continuity efficiencies that you might not have otherwise been doing if 10 years ago you just kind of like flipped open a code editor and started coding, you know, straight away. Buy It is obviously becoming cheaper now and more powerful because of software as a service. And I think that more automation within SaaS is starting to have an impact on open source or Build It budgets, especially with brochureware or short life sites. So, you know, if you've got a client coming to you for a campaign site, then, you know, that's only going to last 2 or 3 months. then maybe the time that it might take to kind of build that in something like Drupal is just going to make that project cost ineffective. If it can be more quickly kind of done in a SaaS option, and I think there you're kind of struggling with what the client's perception on cost with. So, SaaS is definitely having a kind of downwards drag, I think, on the budgets that are available for certain projects. Obviously, open source is becoming more diversified because of stronger players, both at the solution level like WordPress, and also the agencies like Pragmatic, who are actually using WordPress in a genuinely enterprise way. They're building some pretty big solutions using WordPress as their CMS of choice. And about 6 or 7 months ago, we went head to head with a similar agency to Pragmatic for a project that could have been built in WordPress or could have been built in Drupal. And it was probably one of the first pitches that I've been to where it actually wasn't about selling in Drupal and was Drupal better than WordPress or was WordPress better than Drupal, because actually the client was saying, we actually think that either can do the job for us, and that we're just going to kind of take the decision based on the qualities of the agency and what we think that agency can offer for us. And I think for me that was a big wake-up call in terms of how far WordPress has come recently in being able to do some of the things that Drupal also does well. And recently we've lost some work where we've lost it to WordPress agencies purely because they're able to work through some of that stuff much more quickly than we seem to be able to kind of work through it with Drupal. So I don't know if that's a problem with us, or I don't know whether that's a kind of problem with Drupal, but it's definitely something that we've seen happen within the market. As I mentioned earlier, I think PaaS is moving open source closer to kind of buy it, because it's kind of creating that level of vendor lock-in to some extent. So obvious examples there are Acquia and Drupal. Look at the difference between WordPress.com and WordPress.org. Look at how Sugar CRM kind of sells its services. What sometimes worries me is when I hear people working for PaaS organisations who start talking about Sugar CRM as being the kind of model to follow, because I think from an open source perspective, that's definitely, if you're an evangelist of open source, I don't think you really want to see, PaaS organisations see Sugar CRM as the model to follow, because I just don't think that that's the way to go. Now, when I last made this presentation in 2015, I was talking about how we were looking to flick the switch from being an agency, and actually what you were talking about earlier with your new website that's just about to come out, I'm going to use the same excuse as well. We got a new website that's just about to come out as well, and it's going to talk much more about us being a full service agency and less about us being Drupal specialists. And we've started to kind of make that move over the last year in terms of offering more services around user research, and both from a kind of qualitative and quantitative perspective, and doing more design work and more UX work. And I think that the reason that I've wanted to do that is that as Drupal specialists, we did quite well making it obvious that we were Drupal specialists and letting that work find us, which was great. It brought us enough work in, but it was always really reactive. So you were never in control of how your business was going to grow because it was too reactive. And it started making me think about, I want to become more sector specific and start to be able to kind of proactively kind of target sectors on the business problems that I think that my business can resolve for them. So in that respect, that's taking the farming analogy a little bit further, is to say, yeah, we're still farmers, but we're now going to specialise around certain crops. And where I think that is important in terms of what we might use from an open source perspective is, let's say, for example, we were going to target the sports market, and in particular target Premier League clubs. And let's say we got an opportunity to work with someone like Chelsea, right? That opportunity we get to work with Chelsea may not come at the point where Chelsea are ready to re-platform. So if Chelsea are on WordPress at that point, there's a chance for us to work with them, and then maybe kind of manage and maintain their WordPress solution until such time as we can create an excuse to, or a reason to re-platform them, if there even becomes a reason. We're not going to turn down the chance to work with that business just because they won't or don't use Drupal if we are pursuing a sector strategy. And so in terms of becoming more full service, we're now having to force ourselves to be more solution agnostic. Now, I think earlier in your presentation, you were being very bullish about the, the opportunities of Drupal and the fact that kind of Drupal can kind of do all of these, do all of these things, and and maybe it can. And I think for us, it should always be about being open source. And if it's open source, we should always be committed to contributing back, because open source and community just go hand in hand. And I think that you should, accept that for a whole bunch of reasons. I think it is wrong to use open source software without actually having a commitment in some way to actually contribute back to that community, whether it's through code, whether it's through organising events, whether it's through all the things that are on your slide earlier, Jam. Everybody has to be committed to doing that. And ideally, for us, it would always be Drupal. But I sometimes think that price and scope and perception and maybe sensible risk-based views to technical debt mean that other solutions make better sense. So, if you're going to build a short-term, website for a particular campaign, and the technical debt bit of that is a small bit of custom PHP that you've got to write to maybe do some kind of data capture, maybe that technical debt is worth incurring if that site's only going to be live for 6 months. Now, I think a lot of people in the Drupal community don't want that to be true, but I'm not too sure at the moment how a business like ours, if we're going to contribute, how our contribution can be based around trying to kind of make Drupal be all things to all people. So that's a challenge that I've got at the moment, and one that I've only really been thinking about a lot in the last sort of 6 or 7 days when I realised I had to update my slides. And as this presentation makes clear, we're still very much advocates of open source. But I think that I'm starting to think now that actually all things have got their sweet spot. Even things like buy it and build it have got their sweet spots. But then also Drupal has got its sweet spot too. And this is where I think Drupal's sweet spot is that I think Drupal still is the best solution that we can use where your project runs a risk of hitting a ceiling if you were to use anything else. And I say that on the basis that there isn't a single project that we've ever built in Drupal in which Drupal has ended up proving to be the wrong choice because we've hit a point at which we cannot do something with it. And that then ties into the second point about if development is iterative and ongoing, and particularly for like iterative ongoing projects which are kind of based around an agile methodology, that just works really, really well with Drupal. That's Drupal's kind of key strength. Any level of integration, particularly if you're kind of doing things like pulling in data from feeds, so if you're working in, say, the travel sector and you're ingesting lots of, data in terms of like tour providers and flights and stuff like that, the fact that you can ingest all that data, create kind of nodes and contents around it, index all that in a Solar or Elasticsearch, and then again, sites that need decent search solutions, for me, key strengths of Drupal. Just going back to this where development is iterative and ongoing, I know that WordPress is starting to improve in terms of, what you can do around kind of code-driven development and comparable things to features. But it's not quite there yet, and I wouldn't want to be building an ongoing project where actually I feel that I've got, struggles around deployment, and I think that Drupal's got deployment, nailed pretty well. Projects that need to scale, where you've got to do a lot of work around kind of performance and caching. I think Drupal lends itself well to that. And also, the two most important things, and similar to what you were saying earlier, the opportunity for distributions and for multi-sites. And more, I think the sweet spot will need to be seen. And the biggest point of differentiation will be around what headless and decoupled opportunities there are with Drupal 8. And a couple of the Mighall team are going to be talking about that a little bit in tomorrow's sessions. So I think that probably means time for the pub, because I'm parched. Unless there are any questions. But other than that, thank you very much.